Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have a return guest, Dr. Lydia Moland. He is a professor of philosophy at Colby College. Last time we talked about Hegel, Marx, a little bit of abolitionism and feminism in the 19th century, and today we're focusing on her book, which is now on paperback as well, Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life. So, Dr. Moland, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you. Likewise, it's always a pleasure for me to talk to you as well.
So, first of all, just before we get into Lydia Child's personal story and her intellectual achievements and contributions, let me just ask you sort of a more personal question. So, what got you interested first in American abolitionism, particularly from the 19th century?
Yes, thank you for that question. So as you say, I'd spent my whole career doing German philosophy. I wrote a couple books on Hegel, wrote some on Schiller and other German idealists. I was very happy doing that. And then after the 2016 election, in the United States, I had a moment of thinking that I really needed to change my life in order to react to the new political reality in my country. And I started to wonder what women in particular had done to address moral emergencies in the past. And I thought, well, I have some expertise in the 19th century. I know my way around the thinkers there. And I also had the feeling that it would be good for me as an American citizen to sort of come home and think about my own country and its own history, where I'd usually been thinking more about Germany. So I just thought, what were American women? And I thought it would be interesting to look at women doing with philosophy in the 19th century especially to address moral emergencies in their country. And obviously the big moral emergency in the United States in the 19th century was slavery and the Civil War in particular. And so I was very naive, but I had a vague recollection that women had been important in the fight against slavery in the 19th century. So I went to the Harvard Library for the History of Women, the Schlesinger Library, and asked what they knew about women using philosophy in the 19th century. And they didn't have an immediate answer, but they gave me a box of folders, actually, that someone else had asked to see the day I happened to go. And in that box was a letter from this woman, Lydia Maria Child. I had never heard of her. I had no idea who she was. But the letter was so electrifying to me. It spoke to me so immediately. It was clearly by one activist to another. So someone who was trying to figure out how to address a moral question. And it spoke with such clarity and such wisdom and so philosophically that I thought I should really look into this person. So I started looking into her. I couldn't believe what I found. I couldn't believe how accomplished and how well-known and how influential Child was in her own life, and that I had never heard of her. And I was so impressed by the way she used philosophical thought to tackle the major moral issues of her time that I just kept thinking and writing about her. And that's how I ended up writing this book.
So, tell us now then about her. Who was she exactly?
Yeah, so she was born in 1802 in a town called
Mhm,
Medford, Massachusetts, which is very near Boston.
mhm.
Her father was a baker. He had been born an American citizen just after the Revolution. And actually, that's not true. He was a boy still during the Revolution. Anyway, so
Mhm.
it had been a generation in which people had gone from being British citizens to being American citizens. He was very patriotic, as were many people for that reason. But he had no formal education. He was a very successful baker, but not an intellectual. His wife also had no formal education. Lydia Maria Child was the youngest of their children. They had no interest in educating girls. They had no interest in educating boys either. but their son, who was just 5 years older than Lydia,
Yeah.
his name was Converse. He had this inexplicable love of books, and he was sort of mentored by the local teacher and the local minister. He loved books so much that the family doctor finally took his parents aside and said, he's not going to be of any help to you in the bakery, so you might as well send him to Harvard. So they sent him to Harvard, where he later became a professor at Harvard in the divinity school. Anyway, all of that to say that she didn't have an extensive education. She went to primary school, but there was no high school for women like her. But she had a brother who loved books and loved teaching her about the books he was reading. So as a very young woman, sort of 12, 13 years old, she was reading Milton, she was reading Shakespeare. She soon discovered the novels of Walter Scott. And this just launched her into this world of ideas that she remained enthusiastic about her whole life. Anyway, so she went from being a voracious reader to being a very early writer. She wrote her first novel when she was 22 years old. It was still very unusual for a woman to write a novel in the United States or anywhere, really. So she published it pseudonymously or anonymously. She just said it was by an American. And it caused a kind of sensation slash scandal. It was about a Native American warrior who married a European settler, which, as you can imagine, was controversial. But it did well enough that she became a fairly well-known author. She then followed that up by writing another novel, by writing children's fiction, by starting to write other nonfiction. And that meant that by the time she was 30, she was something essentially unheard of, which was a self-sufficient female author in the United States. And she also published a self-help book it was a kind of combination of recipes and medical advice, housekeeping tips. But even there, and this is transitioning more to her thought, it's a very philosophical book insofar as she says very clearly at the beginning that what she wants is for Americans to realize that in order not to reinstate the aristocracy that they had just fought a war to get rid of, Americans needed to be self-sufficient. They needed to know how to take care of themselves, how to make their own soap, and cure their own diseases. And she really makes clear that this is a kind of political philosophy embodied in what Americans should be doing. So that was another way in which I think she sets up her real philosophical commitments, which become much clearer once she encounters the abolitionist movement.
But then when it comes to her own intellectual path, she was mostly self-taught, right?
She was. And she was very proud of that. And beyond being proud of that, I think she thought that it had saved her from some problems that trained intellectuals often encounter in their moral lives. So this becomes a sort of theme that insofar as she knew of professional philosophers, which she did, she knew Ralph Waldo Emerson, she knew Bronson Alcott, she could see that their education had sometimes made them very careful, very conservative, very focused on thinking rather than doing. And in a way, this was more true of Emerson, unwilling to engage in the messier parts of actual life. So most people, if they know anything about Emerson and slavery, think of him as a kind of moral hero who came out very strongly in favor of John Brown after John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which was meant to instigate an insurrection among enslaved people. But actually, Emerson came to that very late. He was very tepid about abolitionism for most of his life. And Child ascribed to him and others then the sort of concern that they had let their educations get in the way of their moral compass. And so in a way, I think she felt lucky that she didn't have that kind of distraction. But I'll say too, as a young person, she engaged with Plato, she engaged with Locke. She had a study group with Margaret Fuller on Locke and Germain de Stael. She was very influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg, who was a philosopher and mystic in Sweden. So she had read very widely, but yes, she was essentially self-taught.
But when did she start actually writing on philosophy? Because if I understood correctly, at least in her early writing career, she was writing mostly novels, right? But then when exactly did she go into philosophical writings, let's say?
Yeah, I would say that it really happened once she discovered abolitionism.
Okay.
So it's really important for Americans in particular to understand that abolitionism in the 1830s, so about the time she was 30 years old, was still a radical position among Americans. So I think many Americans think that most Northerners especially were against slavery from the beginning, and that's just not true. Even Northerners who were against slavery were very uncomfortable, usually with the position of abolitionism, which was the claim that slavery should end immediately, not
Mhm.
gradually, and that it should end without compensation to enslavers. So to embrace a position like that was essentially to become a kind of social pariah. It was to risk ostracism and condemnation by all of the kind of proper people, in somewhere like Boston, which was very concerned with itself as the sort of beacon of intellectual
Yeah.
sophistication in the United States. So Child had also, disliked slavery, but been sort of tepid about, thinking, well, probably it's going away anyway, and probably it's not as bad as some people make it sound. But then in 1830, she met a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who was a radical abolitionist. He was a white man, but he had moved to Boston to build on the abolitionist community among Black Americans there. And he, as a white author and editor, was looking for converts, for people who could help him spread the message of abolitionism. And he knew that Child was a very effective novelist, so that she could reach people emotionally.
Yeah.
He knew that she was a very effective arguer because she'd taken a position on other issues before that. And she was a household name. She was known in the North and the South for her literature and for her advice to all kinds of people, including about very practical things. So he met with her. And she describes meeting with him as a kind of conversion experience, where as we say, the scales fell from her eyes, and she suddenly realized that this thing that she hadn't thought about carefully before was absolutely true and deserved her devotion and attention in all of her efforts. So at that point, I think she really started to think philosophically, which is to say, to think about what kinds of arguments would work to change people's hearts and minds on this question. So in 1833, she published the first book-length argument against slavery in the United States. It was called An Appeal in Favor of That Class of Americans Called Africans. And to my mind, it's a deeply philosophical work for a couple of reasons. One is that it asks the big questions, right? So what is justice? What is humanity? What is truth? What does it mean to think of someone else as a human being? But also insofar as it's a fire hose of argumentation. So she takes all of the reasons and excuses that people had been using, people like her, people in the North, had been using to excuse their apathy about slavery. And she just takes them down one by one, sometimes in a very Socratic style. So she'll put up a kind of usual conventional reason for not interfering in the South, for instance. And then she'll just list all of the reasons why that is a hypocritical position, why it's a nonsensical position, why it's in tension with American values, etc. So this book had several chapters. It had a couple of chapters on the history of slavery, the economics of slavery, the moral problems with slavery, the intellectual character of Africans and their descendants, etc. And then the last chapter is aimed squarely at Northerners. And the first sentence of it is something like, while we bestow our earnest disapprobation on our brethren in the South, let us not flatter ourselves that we are any better than they. This was absolute treason as far as most people in Boston were concerned, to say that Bostonians were as guilty in the on the topic of slavery as people in the South was a heresy. So she was really ostracized at that point. Again, I think there are some interesting parallels to Socrates here, right? So she kind of shows up in the public square. She asks people kind of basic questions about their thoughtlessly held beliefs and shows them to be deeply hypocritical and uninformed, and in captives of terrible arguments, destroys those arguments, and is essentially that she wasn't killed, but she was ostracized. And there were times in which her life was threatened, and it was a very dangerous position to take, especially as a woman. So when she had published these other books, people had been uneasy, and should women really be writing novels, and should they really be messing around in these topics? But for a woman to talk about economics and politics and history, and then to call Northerners hypocrites, was really beyond the pale. So at that point, then her life really changed. She lost her income from her books. People stopped buying her books. And she and her husband essentially lived in poverty for the rest of their lives. So there's lots more to say about her philosophy, but I would say that is one of the moments that I would say becomes a kind of philosophical turn for her. She never called herself a philosopher. In fact, she resisted being called that, I think in part because she was afraid of how the people she knew of who were philosophers let that get in the way of their actions. But there's no question that she both used philosophy and that she thought philosophically.
But then when it comes to abolitionism, how influential was she back then in terms of this movement?
She was very influential. She was very well known. Lots of people wrote to her throughout her life to tell her that she had changed their minds and changed their lives.
Yeah.
Some of what she wrote about slavery sold very, very well. She never took money for it, which is part of why she remained impoverished. But I'll give you one example. So this is much later in 1859. After John Brown's failed insurrection against slavery in Virginia, she wrote to the governor of Virginia asking to come and nurse John Brown, who was then in prison. The governor of Virginia, so she was famous enough that the governor of Virginia wrote back and said, yes, you can come and visit him. But he took some time to scold her, right? To say that John Brown's violent raid was the fault of people like her, who had been, saying such extreme things about slavery, that people like John Brown became violent about it. He then published her letter without her permission and his letter reprimanding her in the press. This gave her the opportunity to write back in the press. And it was this, 5-7 page, I forget, just destruction of his terrible arguments again. That caused another woman in the South to write this very angry reply to Child and published that in the newspapers. And then that gave Child an opportunity to publish again an even longer rebuttal. I mean, she was a master of rhetoric. And these people, I don't think they quite knew what they were getting into when they sort of baited her into responding. And then so all of those letters together were then published as a pamphlet, which sold 300,000 copies, which is an incredible number for the population of the United States at that time. I think it was the 19th century equivalent of going viral. And when she died, people were very clear that she had, in many cases, reached a part of the population that some of the other major abolitionist speakers were unable to reach. So I think during her lifetime, she was considered very, very influential.
By the way, when did she die exactly? Did she live at least to see, for example, the end of the Civil War or not?
She did. So she died in
Mhm.
1880. So
Okay.
the Civil War ended in 1865. So yes, she saw the end of the war. She saw emancipation. She was surprisingly non-triumphant about that, in part because she was so saddened and discouraged by the fact that it took a war to end slavery. And she was convinced, correctly, as it turned out, that unless slavery ended because white Americans actually changed their hearts and minds, as opposed to being forced to give up slavery through violence, that slavery would just reassert itself in another form, which it very quickly did in the South, around things like Black codes, and then later Jim Crow laws. And there are many parts of slavery that survive in the mass incarceration system in the United States now, not to mention just the survival of racism. So, and she lived long enough to watch Reconstruction, which was the attempt to rebuild the South with a more just racial framework, to see that fail. So she, I think, died very discouraged about the future of racial justice in the United States. And I should say that the fact that she was interested in racial justice and racial equality rather than just the end of slavery also really made her a radical. So there were lots of Northerners who thought that slavery should end, were sort of slowly convinced that it should end, but that did not mean that they thought that Africans and their descendants were the equals of whites. So they maybe thought they shouldn't be enslaved exactly, but they definitely did not want them in schools, in churches, in theaters. They didn't, in most cases, didn't want them to be able to vote, right? So the end of slavery did not mean anything like the beginning of racial equality, even for most people in the North. And so Child, from a very early point, wanted both. Right? She wanted the end of slavery and she wanted racial equality. And when she died, it was still very clear to her that that was a long way away in the United States. Still
Uh,
is.
And she was right, because Black people in America had to fight for equal rights at least for the next 100 years, right?
Yes, that's right. And many of those fights are still not over. And in many cases, things are getting worse rather than better as far as racial equality goes.
So something that she also was a women's rights activist, right? So what would you like to tell us about that? What were some of her main ideas and contributions in that domain?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting part of her trajectory. She was much slower to embrace gender equality, as we now call it,
Mhm.
than she was to embrace racial equality. So
Mm.
I think that was in part because, as she herself said, she was much more comfortable fighting for the rights of other people than for her own. So she would say things like, I would rather never talk about women's rights. I would rather just go out and do what I want to do. And, if people don't want me to do it, then I will fight with them, but not until then. And I think at the beginning, she also sort of took the line that women had their own sphere and it was better for them not to get involved in some parts of society. In the 1830s, she got very mixed up in a huge scandal and schism in the abolitionist movement when some men, well, what happened was it was started by people like William Lloyd Garrison, who were radical in many ways, including Garrison believed in gender equality or equality of the sexes. But then as the movement grew and more conservative men wanted to join, they were very uncomfortable with the fact that Garrison had, quote unquote, allowed women to join. And more to the point, that women abolitionists were speaking in public, which was still essentially forbidden. Child herself never spoke in public, as far as I know. She didn't like doing it. She didn't want to do it. But she wanted her female collaborators like Abby Kelly or the Grimke sisters or Mariah Weston Chapman to be allowed to speak if they wanted to. And so when the more conservative men started to say things like, we will join this movement, but only if the women stop speaking and essentially go home, then she fought back. And wrote incredibly eloquent things about not just the equality of men and women, but about what it means to allow individuals to do what their consciences dictate. So her main point of argument against men at that point was more, don't you dare get in the way of my doing what I feel called to do, morally speaking. And gender is like not even, doesn't even have to be part of that unless you, the more conservative men, make it a part of that. So her sense was that the fight about women's involvement in the abolitionist movement was really the fault of men. So sometimes men would say, well, please just don't bring up the women question. That's distracting. And she would say, I didn't bring it up. You brought it up, right? We were just doing what we thought we should be doing. And then suddenly we're told we shouldn't. And then, as is so typical in the history of philosophy, women have to stop doing what they wanted to do, in many cases philosophize, and fight for their right to do that first, which means that they have much less time to develop their philosophies or just to do, and it just becomes an enormous distraction that the men don't have to deal with. So this is a classic problem. Anyway, so later in her life, after the war was over, she did get very involved in the fight for women's suffrage, for the right to vote. She was older at that point. She wasn't as involved as she had been in abolition, but she did write a very powerful series of articles in The Independent. Again, in a very philosophical way, just destroying all of the arguments that people were making to keep women from voting. So that there's also amazing philosophical thinking going on there. I'll mention one other thing that was very painful for her around this topic, which was that your listeners and viewers might know that in the United States after the war, the 13th Amendment ended slavery, but no Africans or their descendants could vote yet on the federal level. Like there was no federal guarantee of that. It varied by state. But when the 15th Amendment was proposed to allow Black men the right to vote, some feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony started to oppose it because it was going to keep women from voting. So the language of the 15th Amendment ended up introducing the idea that only men could vote, that hadn't been in the Constitution previously. So for Child, that was so painful to watch the women's movement then splinter between those who opposed the 15th Amendment because it was bad for women and those who said it is bad for women, but Black men desperately need the right to vote if Reconstruction is going to continue in the South, so we should support it anyway. Child was definitely in the latter camp. So she said she wished that the 15th Amendment didn't specify men, but she supported it for the sake of Black male voters. But this is another example of how the quote unquote woman question became a real issue for people who were trying to fight for racial justice as well.
Mhm. No, yeah, I mean, in the history of universal suffrage, there's always this trend of first we introduce the voting rights to, I mean, in certain places, people who own land themselves, which were men for the most part, but then we expand to the rest of the males, but perhaps not the blacks, and then perhaps also the blacks, and then perhaps also
Yeah.
women. So I mean, it's always tiny steps, but that's almost it's the same almost everywhere
Yeah,
across the world. So it's not a problem that was specific to the United States,
indeed,
unfortunately.
indeed.
But we were talking about abolitionism and women's rights. In her work, in Lydia Child's work, did her ideas on abolitionism intersect in any way with her ideas on women's rights or not?
Yeah, I think they did, insofar as she did believe in a kind of universal justice that would come to include everyone. So
Yeah.
there's a real sense in her work, I think, that people are basically good. They're equal for sure as individuals, and they're also basically good. And what keeps us from being good to each other are bad arguments that we, hear and then repeat as excuses not to be the kind of people that we should be. So I think she sometimes abolitionists of this period are accused of being kind of one issue fanatics. And she really wasn't. And that's not fair to say about many of them too, but she really thought that in order to address these problems of inequality and prejudice more generally, you had to articulate something, a more broad truth about love in some cases. So that was something that she talked about from Swedenborg as well, that there's a kind of universal force of love that unites us and makes us
Yeah.
equal, that if we, again, got these bad arguments out of the way, we would be more able to let that shine through, as it were. So yeah, I think for her, it was not a matter of, this issue and then that issue, but trying to reorient people around a more universal understanding of humans as equal and love as a greater force that would then solve many of these problems as opposed to one after the other.
Mhm. So, and because also, unfortunately, in the US, there's never been a lack of oppressed peoples. What about the Native Americans? Did she also write on their right, on them and their rights, or not?
Yeah, in fact, this was the first cause that she felt very passionately about. So, as I mentioned, her first novel had to do with a Native American warrior marrying a European settler.
Hmm.
That novel ends with, it's very complicated, but with that Native American warrior giving up his right, as it were, to this woman and ceding it to a European who had a prior claim on her, and then just kind of disappearing into the forest, literally.
Hmm.
And this was very radical at this time, because most people around Child would have been arguing that the only way for European settlers to be victorious, which was clearly the point, was to exterminate the indigenous population. And she was trying to make the argument through this novel that force wasn't necessary, that violence wasn't necessary, that because at that point she still believed that European civilization was superior, that Native Americans would just sort of fade away and that it didn't require killing them. So this is not much better, right? To say that don't worry, they will just sort of voluntarily cede their position. She really came to reject that fairly early on, in part because the man that she married, David Lee Child, was a staunch defender of Native American rights, including the rights of Native Americans to defend themselves with violence if necessary, and it was necessary, against European settlers. So she wrote fairly early on a scathing book about European atrocities against Indigenous Americans. And again, it's just one thing after another, how hypocritical this is, how cruel this is. And these people call themselves Christians, and they claim to be followers of Jesus, and how can they sleep at night, essentially, is the undertone. So that was really one of her earliest moral convictions, that what was happening to the Native population in the United States was an atrocity, a genocide. She didn't use that word, and a terrible stain on the conscience of the country. And then after the Civil War, she returned to that theme and wrote a very powerful piece. It's called Appeal for the Indians, which is not a word that we use to describe Indigenous people anymore. But it's very similar to the appeal that she wrote in favor of that class of Americans called Africans, in that it tears down all kinds of bad arguments, articulates this philosophy of integrity. If Americans want actually to claim to embrace these ideals of justice and equality, they cannot continue behaving this way. If they do, they're being hypocritical and delusional, and in many cases not. They know exactly what they're doing. But I will say one other thing that I tend to think about a lot when I think about that piece is that she still had, and this was true sometimes of her interactions with Black Americans as well, this kind of assumption that eventually these cultures would assimilate to European culture. She was very clear that European culture was deeply flawed and that in many ways delusional about its superiority. But she nevertheless continued often, as did many people, to make arguments like Native Americans are like our younger siblings. They just haven't grown up yet. And once they are exposed to our culture, they will be like us. Now, again, that was radically progressive for her time, because many people were saying that Native Americans were not capable of that and just were, violent and savage and needed to be exterminated. And she completely rejected that, but on the other hand, did suggest that part of the kind of progress of history was going to be the assimilation of Native people to European culture. I should say that one of the points that she makes over and over again is the hypocrisy of calling Native Americans, in this case, savages or barbarous, when what was happening was that European settlers were acting with horrendous violence and barbarism against them. So she's very clear that European culture, as then absorbed by Americans, was the violent one and the one that needed to be called out for its savage behavior. But nevertheless, I think she held out this kind of ideal that, European culture, if we actually followed it, as opposed to not following it by engaging in these atrocities, was the one, in her mind, the one that had articulated the kinds of truths about equality and justice that she wanted people to follow. Again, a naive position in many ways, but progressive for its time.
So just earlier, I asked you if you saw any intersections between her work on abolitionism and her work on women's rights. More broadly, do you see common threads across all of her intellectual, non-fictional work on the rights of all of these different kinds of peoples, like the Black Americans, the Native Americans, and women?
Yeah, I think so. Again, generally the claim that all humans are have a kind of equality insofar as we're all, I mean, there's a kind of Kantian sense even about dignity and the inviolability of the person. And then the sense that humans, once they have power, are very good at making up arguments to deny that. And insofar as she has a more pessimistic view of human nature, I think that would be it. So on the one hand, all humans have this potential for great achievement and love for each other, but we're very distractible by bad arguments. And that always, if there are these parts of the population, whether it be women or Native Americans or Black Americans, who can be described by those in power in false and derogatory ways, it's always going to be in the interest of the powerful to promote those stories in a way to keep them in power. So I think that sort of those different strands between beliefs about human nature on the good hand on the one hand and not on the other would be another sort of basic philosophical commitment, I think.
So how would you classify Lydia Maria Child as an intellectual? Because earlier, if I remember correctly, at a certain point you said that she herself didn't refer to herself or talk about herself as a philosopher, and you also mentioned that she had some criticisms of common or traditional intellectuals. I mean, in your mind, how would you classify her as an intellectual?
Yeah, I think of her as someone who thought philosophically, but who was primarily interested in philosophical thinking in order to decide how to live.
Yeah.
And in a way, that is how Western philosophy got started, right? That is what Socrates said, that, the unexamined life is not worth living. And the point of philosophy is to be better people. And I think philosophy often gets so distracted from that, right? And the more abstract and intellectual it becomes, the more disengaged from those real questions about how thought can help us live better lives. And we just lose sight of that. So this is an ongoing question whenever you try to deal with women in the 19th century who are thinking philosophically. And I'm actually editing a volume about women in the United States and Great Britain who were either philosophers or thought philosophically in the 19th century. And I mean, it becomes a kind of self-defeating question in a way if you're always trying to decide, well, were they philosophers or were they not philosophers? They weren't allowed to be philosophers. They weren't allowed to get university degrees until very late in the century. So that's the wrong question that people sometimes ask. But I also think that for the sorts of reasons we talked about a while ago, often women couldn't just think philosophically abstractly without first making the argument that they were allowed to. And so then they had to engage in what we might call social philosophy or social activism, which then gives people more of an excuse to dismiss them, right? And say, well, that's not really philosophy, that's social theory or that's activism. So part of what I and others who are working in this field are really trying to do is push back against that, in part by showing that in the 19th century, it was much more common for people to think of philosophy in those terms. So the abstract, reified, ivory tower kind of philosophy has not always been the way philosophy has been understood. And so if we're constantly judging people in the past by that standard, that's not historically accurate, and it's also not just. And I think that, for me, I love doing abstract philosophy. As I say, I loved writing on Hegel. I hope to continue doing it. It's also, and Hegel has like such a deep and wide and brilliant and ingenious system in which there's so much richness and so much potential for just glorious thought. It's also true that he got some very basic moral things very wrong. right? So anything about gender, anything about race, he tends to get terribly wrong. So on the one hand, we can think about people like Hegel as paradigmatic philosophers. I want to be sure that we don't therefore ignore the fact that it's important to pay attention to people who are getting the moral questions right, even if they don't have the big historical system, philosophical systems. And again, back to an early point, maybe even because of that, right? The child is not engaging in this kind of big system building, and in a way that's a reflection of her clear moral compass. So this is a very long answer to your question, how I would characterize her as an intellectual. I'd say she's someone who was a social activist in a way that was founded in philosophical thinking, and that used philosophy in the classic original Socratic sense, both to try to help other people see the errors in their thoughts, and also to live a worthwhile life that reflects the kinds of values that we profess to have. So she might be unclassifiable in that way, but those are the terms in which I think of her.
And as far as we could identify her as a philosopher, what questions do we think that she forces us to ask ourselves?
I think so many of them have to do with integrity and hypocrisy. So, what are our values, and are we living up to them? So, in what ways do we allow ourselves to be distracted by bad arguments from the kinds of things that we know we should be paying more attention to, or the sorts of things that we know are wrong? I think she's so good at appealing to our better natures in a way that can be really inspiring, and also to ask us to think whenever we feel convicted that something's wrong, and then get sort of distracted by thinking, well, maybe we can't do anything about it, or maybe it's not as bad as it looks, or we find some argument that makes us feel less guilty, that is something that we need to be careful about, and more honest with ourselves about.
And specifically, do you think that she perhaps puts into perspective what the role of intellectual should be? Particularly you yourself, you are an academic, and sometimes academics get very mad, get annoyed by, I don't know, political activists, and they don't like for people to try to moralize what they're doing, or to try to push them into politics, political activism, moral questions or moral considerations that might derive from the kind of work they're doing. They try to reduce everything into the pursuit of truth with a capital T or something like that, and be very abstract. So do you think that perhaps Lydia Child would also put that a little bit into perspective, or not?
Yeah, definitely. And I don't want to cast aspersions on anyone, but she's definitely changed the way I think of myself in the world and think of myself as an academic. She's the kind of person, once you've read enough of her, it's very hard to live your life the same way again. And I think it's important to be open to the concern that some of us who think we are living good lives are actually contributing to the problems that we say we want to address in really fundamental ways. So I've tried very hard to reorient myself in lots of ways, the way I teach, what I write, how I spend my money. I'm still absolutely nothing like the kind of activist she was. I don't flatter myself that I do that. But I think especially that we're facing multiple crises in our world, from environmental to political, and I think academics need to be very careful about thinking about the value of what we do. I'm not saying that abstract thought doesn't have any value, but I do think that someone like Child can help us worry about that more, and try to use the intellectual tools that we have actually to try to make a better world. And again, I understand that there will be people who say that's not my job, to which I would say, well, okay, but let's be clear about that. And maybe, one other way of putting this is that one thing I really admire about Child, she was very good at looking at what her skills and talents and gifts were, and then applying those in a way that would have real effect. So she knew she was a good writer. She knew that she was very good at convincing people of things. She was good at practical, and she used those things in the service of the causes that she knew were the important causes of her day. And I think even people who don't think of engaged philosophy as their job can still do things like that. So part of what I think she shows us is that everyone has ways in which they can engage more fully. And that we, especially as academics, need to be careful not to hide too much behind some sort of belief that what we do is so important or so impressive that the real world isn't our concern.
And also, of course, in this question, just to be clear, I was not trying to imply that there's not anything at all about the idea that perhaps we should keep morals and politics out of intellectual pursuits, because I mean, there's something to that. It's just that I think that perhaps it's a bit naive for some academics to perhaps think that what they're doing is not at all moral or political, or doesn't have any sort of those kinds of implications, because it has, and also that it is completely, or it occurs in a space that is completely outside of the cultural, political, economic, moral context where they live in, right?
Yes, no, that's very well put. Yeah, I think those are all things that we always need to be thinking about, but in the current moment, probably more than ever.
Yeah. So let me just ask you one last question then. So you wrote, of course, an entire book on Lydia Maria Child. So what would you say are perhaps some of her traits or some of her intellectual achievements that you admire the most about her? I mean, actually, is it the intellectual achievements, her writings? Is it some of her own personal traits, or is it even also because she was a woman in the 19th century, and we all know that even nowadays, but even more so in the 19th century, a woman intellectual, I mean, it was a very hard thing to pull through, I guess.
Yes, yeah, yeah. Yeah, all of those things for sure. As I've been saying, like the power of her thought, the consistency of her thought over decades. So when she converted to abolitionism in the 1830s, I think a lot of abolitionists thought that this would go pretty quickly, that once they made this very strong moral argument to the American public would think, oh, wait, you're right. This is terrible. We have to stop this. But instead, it took 30 years and 750,000 deaths in the civil, like just an incredible amount of blood and violence to end it. But she remained committed all the way through to the end of her life. I really admire that. I also really admire that she never thought of herself as too good to be practically engaged. And I think this is connected to your last question as well. So I haven't even talked about all of the ways in which she actually sometimes physically put herself in this struggle. So she would sometimes go to speeches that were being given by abolitionist speakers at which there were mobs that attacked them, and she would put herself between the speaker and the mob, assuming correctly that the mob was less likely to attack a woman. So she would be physically engaged. She and her husband moved to the middle of Massachusetts to try farming sugar beets at one point in an attempt to undermine the plantation sugarcane trade. So that was another example in which she completely changed where she lived and what she was doing thought economically and agriculturally instead of philosophically, or in addition to philosophically. And also, she was very clear in her engagement with Black Americans, and in trying to support them and make sure that their voices were heard. In some cases, helping them financially, or she did help people on the Underground Railroad. So she was also willing really to engage on a more practical, less intellectual level. She also, during the Civil War, sewed for soldiers and raised money for fugitives from slavery. I mean, she was always thinking what she could do to help actual people, as well as articulating in more abstract ways the kinds of arguments that she also thought were necessary. So it's a kind of, again, engaged philosophy, and how do I put my thoughts into action, that, yeah, I really admire about her.
Great. So the book is again Lydia Maria Child, A Radical American Life. Of course, I'm leaving a link to it in the description of the interview, and also a link to our first interview here on the channel, Dr. Moland. And apart from that, would you like to tell people again where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, thank you. So my website is lydiamoland.com. I am on X and Threads, occasionally anyway. The book, as you mentioned, is out in paperback very soon, and there is also now an audiobook that's on Audible and many other places where people get their audiobooks. So I think this is going to be another time where it'll be really interesting to engage in her thought, and I would love to hear people's thoughts about her if they read the book.
Great. So thank you so much again for coming back on the show. It's always a big pleasure to talk with you.
My pleasure. Thank you again so much for your wonderful questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingford, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londoño Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.